The process of inking a panel begins with the evaluation of the sketch. This is where the artist gets a sense of what their panel needs to achieve. The primary function of inking is visual clarity. Your final image must make sense at a quick glance. If that seems impossible based on the sketch, it's time to go back to the pencil. You're not quite ready to ink. But if you have the makings of a clear composition within your sketch, you are ready to ink. Now, these stages of inking are my personal preference. You could mix and match them however you like, but this is the order I prefer. I always ink my frames first. If you have yet to get comfortable with the nib pen or the round brush, you're going to want to ink your frames with the technical drawing pen. Like a large micron, I prefer the size 08. And maybe even try a ruler if you don't have a steady hand. Some comic artists don't use a ruler. The freehand approach gives a frame character and can make it seem like a more integral part of the narrative. But most comic artists don't want to draw attention to the frames, so a ruler or diagonal line tool, if you're working digitally, is the way to go. Most drawing programs have a shortcut to draw a straight line, like holding Shift, so just Google how to draw a straight line in the software you're using, and you should get some good suggestions. Once you have your panel frames inked, you want to establish the outlines of the panel's main subjects. This would include the main characters of your narrative, possibly some props that they're engaging with, and possibly elements of the setting that surround them. While establishing the outlines of my characters, I'm working with a wider nib pen style digital brush. For a point of comparison, I'd say my line width is between 1/2 and 3/4 the width of my panel lines. I find it a really enjoyable challenge to define the outlines of my characters. It makes me feel more confident in my ideas. Ink is a big part of the personality of your comics and your storytelling, so you want to appear confident in what you're doing to make your readers feel safe. I try not to overdo this first stage of inking, and I always stop when I feel like the subjects of the panel pop. From there, I scale down to deal with the details. I begin by addressing all the details in the characters' clothing and body. This might be wrinkles in the fabrics, texture in the hair. Then I move on to props and elements that surround the character, maybe adding some style to the furniture, and some other elements that establish the environment this character is in. To bring form to my line work, I think about light sources and how the angle of light is affecting the subjects of my scene. If you've watched my class Illustration by Design, you'd know I'm very influenced by the smoky and snaky line art of the Art Nouveau movement. And I always try to work that look into the shadows of my comics. It's a technique I use to take the reality of my character's world and make it a little more surreal. As a storyteller who works in fantasy and science fiction, I use this technique to make the reality of my character worlds just a little bit surreal. These days, I don't do a whole lot of hatching with my comics. But when you're creating a panel that's black and white, hatching can really help you define certain aspects of the storytelling. Let's set the restriction for ourselves that we can't use any color in this project. So hatching has to help us evoke things in the landscape, for example, grass or sand or wood grain. And as color's so emotive, we have to use hatching to try to evoke those same types of emotions, creating emotive lines around a character to show their energy level. Even how we ink our environments can help establish the emotional feel of the story. So we can use hatching techniques to create some structural balance in the horizon line to give a cool, calming feel. And we can do the same thing with building materials, like the siding on a structure. When it comes to lettering these days, I'm often working with a font just to save time, even though often I'd prefer to do it by hand. I try to be very particular about the fonts I choose and how they reflect on the project's inking style. For example, in this middle grade sci-fi comic that's got a really playful, smooth inking style, I use the font called the Sequentialist. But on an older project like my comic Witch Knots, which was done with a more gritty pen nib, I made my own font because I couldn't really find anything that suited the project. And you can see the font's got kind of a grittier pen nib look to it. Your approach to comic storytelling is going to help you decide whether to use a font or to ink by hand. So ideally, I'd like to do the lettering on my new project by hand, but it's a massive commitment, especially for someone who likes to work and rework their dialogue until the last possible minute. If you're going to hand letter a comic, make sure your lettering is as clear as your visual. Create 2 guidelines of a base and height to fit your letters between. Some artists prefer a more italicized comic style to create a sense of motion, but other artists prefer an unaffected text that sits more rigidly and clearly on the page. When it comes to lettering, it's the choices that don't stand out that are best suited for the project. To wrap up this lesson on inking, I'm just going to say that inking is very important. It's one of the things that distinguishes how the reader responds to your storytelling. And the best way to get good at inking is to take time focusing on each of the stages of your practice. Now, the second best way to get good at inking is to look at how other comic artists do it and try to learn from their success. In the next chapter, I'll share some of my favorite inkers with you.